We are doing a series called The Pacific Heart Attitudes, and we've talked about what are seven values that we have or attitudes that we aspire to be as a church and we aspire to be as people, not just in church-related things, but in our homes and at work, in our community and in organizations. We've looked at put the success of others above your own, and the simplest way I think of this is that what naturally comes to us is me first, then you. And this first attitude seeks to do the opposite. First you, then me. In our marriage, in our relationships, at church, at work, that kind of attitude can have a big difference in wherever you are. The second one is to live an authentic life, to be open and honest about life. We don't pretend that life is easy or it's easier than it really is. Church ought to be a place where we can talk honestly about life and the difficulties. Now, it's not that you're going to talk to everybody about that, but every person ought to have at least one or two people where you can share your story and the difficulties of your story, and where you and I are people who are interested in hearing other people's stories and connect with them. Our third one is clear up relationships. You put any two people together in the same room, you're going to have conflict inevitably in a marriage, in a home, at work, in a church. This third attitude, clear up relationships, simply means when we mess up, we fess up. Try to do that as quickly as we can. Last week we invest our time and talents. We are not like the movies where people come to the movie and they watch the show and they eat popcorn and they go home and they criticize the movie or the movie theater. We are people who are engaged in trying to serve outside of our walls and inside of the walls. And when I think of this attitude, invest your time and talent, we aspire to everybody to grab a hold of the wagon and pull. Grab a hold of the wagon, we pull the wagon together. Today we look at follow spiritual leadership. Follow spiritual leadership. Of course, that's related to a church, but also the principle of authority that God embeds into life and into culture has a way of making its way into your work world, into community organizations, into schools, and into homes. When Leonard Bernstein was he's the late director of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, was asked, what is the hardest instrument to play? And without missing a beat, he said, second fiddle. And he said, I can get a lot of people to play first violin, but trying to find somebody who's willing to play second fiddle and to play it with enthusiasm, that is a problem. He said, without a second fiddle, we do not have harmony. Part of what we aspire to be as a church is people who are willing to play second fiddle. This morning, even though I'm the head pastor here, I had several opportunities to play second fiddle just in trying to help things get going today. That's just a part of who we are. What needs to be done? And sometimes you're following your Bible study leader, your life group leader, or your pastor. And other times you're following somebody else who's trying to get something done and could use some help. What can I do to help make your life here a little bit easier? When I think about this thing of follow spiritual leadership, I'm reminded of without this particular quality of following leadership, what you end up with is division and chaos. Think about the workplace. You have some boss that some of the folks don't respect and don't like, and this usually begins in the workroom when the boss is not there and the way we talk about the boss. And eventually that just sort of creeps into the lives of other people. It creeps into our attitudes. It comes out into our words. We would never say this in front of the boss, kind of thing. But the effect of this kind of division is hurtful to people, to individuals. It's hurtful to the morale of the group, and it's also eventually hurtful to the mission or the task of the business. People just clock in and they clock out because there's really not something more that sort of enlivens me and generates enthusiasm in my life. When I think about this, I think about John chapter 7, where Jesus, before he was arrested, prayed that great prayer in John 17, and he prayed that his people, you and I, would experience oneness in the same way that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit have oneness with each other. The Trinitarian love, the delight for Father to Son and Son to Spirit and Spirit to Father. And that the prayer is he's coming to die on a cross to make that possible for you and me. To enter into that same kind of love and joy that the Father shares with the Son and the Spirit and the Spirit with the Father. That kind of powerful love, other-centered love that defers to each other, that considers the other person more important than me, that seeks to honor and edify and build one another up, to overcome that me first, then you, that's in every one of us. That kind of delight, and that then we are to reflect in the relationships that we have with people. One of the interesting illustrations of a lack of following leadership comes from the book of Numbers. And there are 4 chapters there that were very intriguing to me about 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago. I was having some difficulty following leadership in my life. And a good friend of mine encouraged me to do some Bible study on this. And there are 4 chapters in the book of Numbers that that struck me, Numbers 11, 12, 14, and 16. And if you are having a difficulty following leadership in whatever arena, I would suggest this week you read those 4 chapters in the book of Numbers, 11, 12, 14, and 16. Now, the one that I want to just mention today before we get into the message, it comes from Numbers chapter 12. Moses, if you recall, God met him at the burning bush in Exodus 3, and he said, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and you're going to say, let my people go, and Moses was a reluctant leader. I think you've got the wrong guy. You've got to be kidding. And he had all kinds of excuses he threw out there, and God just continued to work with him, to be patient with him. And one of them was, I'm just not good at speaking. And you could almost see God going, okay, I'll let you have Aaron, which is his brother. He'll go and he can be a mouthpiece. And so Moses and Aaron, they go, and the story, the 10 plagues, and Pharaoh finally relents, and the people cross the Red Sea, and they move towards the wilderness, moving around towards the promised land. And it's a mess. The whole thing is one big mess because of the first me, then you, that plagues everyone, both on an individual level and, in that case, as a whole country. At one particular point, Aaron, who was Moses' brother, and Miriam, who was Moses and Aaron's sister, the 3 siblings, in Numbers chapter 12, the story comes to sort of a crescendo here where Aaron and Miriam are talking about Moses. And the topic is he had married an Egyptian woman. The scripture says a Cushite woman, which is Egyptian. And they knew that he shouldn't have done that. And they were upset about that, and they were talking about this. And that led them to the next step where they asked each other and began to ask other people, does God only speak through Moses? The inference being, well, surely he speaks through me, Aaron, and surely he speaks through Miriam. And this beginnings of division could have just been catastrophic for the people. And at this point, God intervenes, and he calls out to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam to come to the tent of meeting. And God comes down in the pillar of cloud, and descends upon the 3 of them. And then the pillar of cloud arises, and it leaves Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And Miriam now has leprosy. And God speaks. And he speaks very powerfully to Aaron and Miriam about the danger of what they're doing. Moses falls on his face. He prays to God, and thankfully Miriam is healed. But it is a stark reminder, a story, of how important our particular quality of following leadership is. In our church, we have people from all kinds of backgrounds. Some Christians, some non-Christians. Some of you come from a very strong atheistic background. in church life, it's easy for everybody to sort of consider, well, yeah, I know a few things about church. In my experience back, we did it this way, we did it that way. Why do we do things this way? That can be chaotic in an organization like ours. So with that, I'd like to dive into the bigger picture of the principle of authority that God has, and for us to get eyes to see this, because this is evaporating in our country and in Western civilization to our detriment. And then talk about what are some things I can do to help build community in our church or in your marriage or at work. So God gives authority for our benefit. This is the first principle. Look at. He gives authority. Authority is a part of civilization, a part of life. Here's one example from Romans 13. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. There's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now, he's not necessarily saying that every leader in a government position was appointed by God, but he's saying the principle of authority has been instituted by God, and our responsibility is to respond to the governing authorities. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. Now, this should be self-evident in our criminal justice system, or even just responding to a policeman who pulls you over. Your response is important here. Verse 3, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. As long as you and I follow the law, then we don't live in fear of the government doing something in general, unless you live in a hostile environment to this. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Do what is right. He will commend you. He is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. This is our criminal justice system. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. Conscience. When I think about the principle of authority in general, not just with government, but across the board, is that authority has two purposes to it, and these are in your handout. It's to provide for us. For government, for example, it provides a modicum of safety and security from other nations, or the threat of war, or from criminals who would like to get into your home and steal things, and also to protect, to provide and protect. Authority is given for your benefit. Now, I'm guessing most of you know that, but you can hear in that statement, our culture no longer really buys that. We question authority. On the inside of your handout, the next point, principle, is we are to submit to authority. This relates to the church here. Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. Now, there are two Greek verbs here that are really great verbs. One of them is the word obey, and it's the peitho, P-E-I-T-H-O, which is the Greek term for to persuade. And the idea here is to be easily persuadable, as opposed to I'm going to sit back and I'm going to have my arms crossed, and you're going to have a hard time convincing me of what you're trying to say. There's an attitude that the writer here of Hebrews is trying to dispel. Our natural leaning as sinful human beings is to sit back and cross our arms. Nobody's going to teach me, not even you. Maybe God can teach me, but not you. The writer says, that's a bad idea. The second word is the word submit, and it's a compound Greek word, which means to arrange under. To arrange yourself under is the literal idea of this. And our word submit is a pretty good singular word for that. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about that in any organization, whether it's your marriage or at work or in a church or community organization, there is a leader. And the idea here is to have the disposition to leave the decision to the people who are in charge, the final decision. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have input into how things are done. We do have input into how things are done. But we start to cross the line when we're sort of like Miriam and Aaron. Does God only speak through Moses? To submit. Number 3, submit within scriptural limits. So this is not a carte blanche. I just need to follow everything. There are situations in every institution. In a marriage, sometimes. At work, sometimes. In a church, sometimes. Where the decision is made and you can't submit to that. Acts 5:29 is an example of this. Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than men." There are a few times in life where that happens, not many, but it's important to understand that we don't just blindly follow leadership. You use your head. We use our head. We ask questions. We give input. We try to understand the mindset of leadership in whatever arena that we're in. So with those 3 big pictures, now I want to talk about how to follow leadership more closely. There was a woman who was working her airline counter, and the customers were coming in, and they were trying to get their seat assignments, and the plane was getting ready to close its doors, and there were some people in line that were anxious about getting on that plane. They didn't think they were going to get there. And one of the guys was back about 15 people, and he jumped out of line. He came up and talked to the woman behind the counter, and he said, "You have got to get me on this plane." And she said, "Well, sir, we're trying to do the best we can, but if you would get back in line, we'll try to get everybody that needs to be on this plane. And he said, No. If you don't get me on this plane, I'm going to miss my meeting. And if I miss that meeting, it's a very important meeting, I'm going to be angry at you." She said, "Well, sir, I'm sorry to hear that, but we'll try to do the best we can. If you get back in line, we'll try to accommodate everyone." And he said, "You do not understand who I am. Do you know who I am?" And this time the woman, with a little bit of sassiness about her, got on the mic and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an older gentleman up here that does not know who he is. If any of you can be of help, would you please come and give us some assistance?" He sort of shut down a little bit and made his merry way back to 15th in line. Now, it turns out that man was the vice president of that airline. In that situation, it was the right thing to submit to one of his employees. So following leadership sometimes doesn't just mean if you're the big guy, you get to do whatever you want to do. It takes some wisdom in this arena, whether you are an employee or a manager, a wife, a child in your home, etc. All right, how to follow leadership. Number 1, be respectful. Be respectful. 1 Peter 2 says, "Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king." Now, this is what we used to say in our country several decades ago, that we honor the position of authority. We don't necessarily have to like the person who's in authority. Now, this particular thing used to be a very strong value in our country. I grew up with this value. And over the last, ever since about the Vietnam War era, this is something that is going right out the window, thing of authority. To be respectful. The word respect there, the Greek word, means to fix the value of, or to fix the price of something. So a picture here is you're going to Walmart, and you've got somebody who's stocking one of the shelves, and they're putting the price on each of the items so that it can be identified when it's scanned up in front. That's what this particular word means. To think about the position, to affix the value of the position, or to show the worth of. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:12, "We ask you, brothers, respect those who work hard among you, who are over you in the Lord, and who admonish you. Hold them in the highest regard and love because of their work. Live in peace with each other." Now, when I was first trying to do this back in Fort Worth as a young Christian, a good friend of mine who was light years ahead of me spiritually, but only a couple years older than me, I was talking to him about this one day and the difficulty. And he said, you know, Seth, in most of life, whether husband and wife, when they get married, or you start a new job or a new career or a new field, or you're a part of some organization, at first it's really easy to follow who the leader is. Because what we see is the leader's strengths, and we respond to the leader's strengths. And we're just so happy. But over time, what you begin to see is that the leader also has weaknesses. And that's when following leadership becomes more difficult. When I think about Moses, initially, we all think Moses was a great leader, but he was a very timid fellow at the beginning, fearful, excuses. He really wasn't all that excited about doing this, and he had some blunders along the way. And Aaron and Miriam looked at those weaknesses and they said, something must be done about that. Well, in reality, everybody who's a leader has weaknesses. I certainly have mine. And for those of you who've been around, longer than about 5 years, you're familiar with some of my weaknesses. And some of those things may change. And some of those things may not change all that much. Well, the same is true for you in the relationships that you have with people too. Ultimately, respect is a choice. It doesn't just come naturally because of the glowing aspects of the leader. It's a choice. In your handout, I've got 4 things here that strike me about this. It is respect to the leader is felt by the leader and demonstrated in relationship. So it doesn't really matter if you think you respect the leader. The question is, does the leader think that you're respected? Second, your words behind his or her back give you indicator of this. A third item is there's the challenge to adapt to the plan. All of us have to adapt ourselves. We defer to one another. Even though I'm the lead guy in our church here, there are plenty of times where I defer to some of the folks, to some of you or to some of our leaders that I serve over. We adapt. Number 4, give your opinion, but you must leave the final decision to leadership. So respect is the first thing that you want to ask yourself. Is that coming through from me? Is that reflective in my attitude? Second, be united. We are a team of people. I appeal to you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, that there be no divisions among you or dissensions among you, but you be perfectly united in mind and thought. We're a team. Now, in a marriage, that idea of teamwork can disintegrate to where we are now rivals and competitors. That can happen in the workplace. It can also happen in the church, where suddenly the ideas that we have become more important than the ideas that somebody else has in our mind. And that's the point at which divisions has just begun, and we hold on to our ideas and our opinions, and slowly what happens in the heart is dissension. And it begins to have an effect on the people around us. Number 3, give input without demand. Give input without demand. Even though we have a hard attitude to follow spiritual leadership, we welcome input. I welcome input. Our leaders, our elders, our staff welcomes input. We are not like the government, the federal government, that thinks they have all the answers and they're going to give us a top-down thing on how to do things. That's not how we want to function. We want to hear from the local school districts in our church, from the folks on the front lines who are doing things. Is there something we can be doing better than we are? At the same time, it's easy to sort of cross the line and to sort of demand that it be different. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. This is an important value for our church leadership. It's an important value for me. I do not want to be a fool. Maybe that's goal number 1. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. 1 Peter 5:5. Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. That's a very strong image there. I love watching college football. Saturday afternoons, evenings, oh my gosh, yeah, it's lots of fun watching that. But the imagery here that Peter just talks about, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. In the college football world, you are the center of the team. And you walk up to hike the ball to your quarterback, and you reach down, and before you hike the ball, you look up, and you see this massive defensive tackle in front of you. Except in this particular situation, it's God himself. And when you hike the ball, you get to deal with him. That's the imagery he has here in 1 Peter. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, that he may exalt you. Input for the leaders to mull over is a good idea. But if you find yourself giving input to push the leaders, there's a line there that's important to consider. On the back of your handout, be hopeful. Think win-win. Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. Now, it's interesting to me that in this particular verse on following, he said, if you can't think of this in any other way except for your own benefit, not the leader, not the organization, not the church, not other people, if for your own benefit, that's how he finishes this verse, for that would be of no advantage to you. So the lowest common denominator, he even says, at least for that, follow leadership, at least for your own advantage. And number 5, be a blessing to people. Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Now, all of us will give an account of our lives. That's true. We will stand before God at the judgment seat of Christ, and he will ask us about our life and what we did and our choices. But in leadership, or spiritual leadership, or spiritual teachers, there's another layer of accountability there that comes into play. And I think about this about once a week. I'm not just some guy up here doing my thing and wanting to do whatever I want to regarding church life. I also am a man under authority to our elders, voluntarily to them, voluntarily to our pastoral staff, but ultimately to God. I can't just be some wingnut out here doing what I want to do. I will give an account to what he thinks I should be doing. And that's important. Obey them so their work will be a joy and not a burden. And here's another layer at which to ask yourself, do I make it easier for my boss at work, my husband at home, for my parents, my pastor or Bible study? Do I make their life easier, or do I make it more difficult? Do I make it a joy for them? Or does my involvement with them usually burden them, make this more difficult than it has to be? Follow spiritual leadership. Follow spiritual leadership. We desire as a church to reflect the Trinitarian love of God to people. It just doesn't happen because we show up. We defer to one another, we yield to one another, we honor one another, we encourage one another, and ultimately, Son and Spirit, and I don't know how this works, but they're on board with the Father's goodwill. And we are to reflect that. A number of years ago, the British Royal Navy was kind of in a big mess because one of their sailors had exerted some undiscipline, had not been disciplined in his job. And the authorities came down on him in a way that seemed to the public in England that was way over the top regarding the discipline, the lack of discipline of this particular sailor. It was a public relations disaster for the British Royal Navy. It was in all the newscasts. It was in all the papers. Everybody talked about this, as you can imagine. And one of the papers decided to, they wrote lots of articles about this. They had op-ed pieces that they wrote. And they asked the people in England to write in and their thoughts on this. And one of the fellows that wrote in was an ex-sailor. And he had a very interesting letter. He said that most people do not understand the value or the importance of discipline in the military. It is something that has to be drilled into all of those who are in the military, because sometimes discipline can save people's lives. And then he told this story in his letter. He said, I was on a ship one night. It was at night and stormy seas. And the wind was howling, and our particular naval ship was towing a much larger ship behind us. And the waves were up and down, and the wind was blowing, and a bunch of us were out on the deck of that ship trying to haul this particular ship. And suddenly, in the middle of all of that, we heard our commander's voices, the commanding officer, yell out, "Down!" He said, in that moment, every sailor on the deck hit the ground on their belly. In the next instant, what went whipping over them was the hawser cable that had snapped, hauling the big ship behind them, and came right above every one of those men, right above their heads, whipping, the steel cable whipping back and forth until it whipped back behind the ship. He said if any sailor had been standing when that hawser cable broke, they would have been sliced in half. Now, when I hear that story, I can hear something in my own heart, and probably in your heart, that at that moment of down would have said, why do I have to do that? What gives him the right to say that? Or to look back and think, well, what could be so striking about this? And of course, if I had done that and you had done that, we would have had a burial at sea. This is not just some sort of idle, nice attitude to have, but it's something that helps to create something sweet among people, in a marriage, at work, with your boss, or in church. Let's pray together. Father, oh, I wish that we could see what you want us to see. Would you overcome all of our natural defenses, that native self that wants to excuse ourselves? Yes, but that rises in the heart. But in my case, and all those things that which we excuse and end up creating chaos and dysfunction and dissension, and inhibit not just relationships, but the message that you have. That the love that Father and Son and Spirit enjoy together, and that you have birthed in our hearts, that could be reflected in our relationships at home and at work and at church, wherever we are, that could be alive with life, to give life to people, to help people begin to ponder their need of Jesus Christ, from where this all begins. Help us to see this. Help us to have eyes to see this and to respond to you and to the people in our lives appropriately.